Is this some kind of joke? The question hung in the crisp autumn air, sharp and condescending. Bryce, the cadet with the impeccably pressed uniform and the sneer that seemed to be a permanent feature of his face, held the training pistol steady. Its black, unyielding muzzle was pressed firmly against the thin, wrinkled skin of Gordon Whitaker's temple. Gordon, all of 87 years old, didn't so much as flinch. He remained seated on the park bench, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the manicured lawns of the town square. His calm was an island in a sea of adolescent aggression. Another cadet, a lanky boy named Peterson, shifted his weight from foot to foot. "Give it up, old man. Just show some respect and we'll be on our way." His voice tried for authority but trembled at the edges. Bryce's was firm. I said, "Are you deaf or just stupid?" He nudged the pistol harder into Gordon's skull. "I am a cadet officer at Westmarch Military Academy. You will stand when I address you." Gordon's eyes, the color of a faded sky, slowly moved from the horizon and settled on Bryce. They were not angry, not fearful. They were simply observant, and in their depths, something ancient and dangerous stirred. The confrontation hadn't started with a gun, it had started with a thermos. Gordon Whitaker liked to take his coffee in the park every Tuesday morning. He'd sit on the same bench facing the Westmarch Academy grounds and watch the cadets drill on the distant parade fields. It reminded him of a time when his own back was straighter, his own legs stronger. He was pouring a cup of steaming black coffee when they approached. 4 of them, walking with the cocksure swagger of young men who believed the uniform they wore made them invincible. They were led by Bryce. He was tall, with a jaw that looked like it was chiseled from granite, and eyes that held a casual cruelty. They saw Gordon, a frail-looking old man in a worn red windbreaker, and marked him as a target for their morning's amusement. "Look at this relic," Bryce had said, his voice loud enough for the whole park to hear. "Probably thinks he's still fighting the Kaiser." The others snickered. Gordon ignored them, taking a slow sip of his coffee. His silence was a canvas onto which they painted their own insecurities. They mistook his stillness for weakness, his quiet for fear. "What's that on your jacket, Pops?" one of them asked, pointing a manicured finger at Gordon's lapel. Pinned there was a small tarnished metal emblem, an eagle, globe, and anchor. It was worn smooth with time, the details blurred, the silver plating long since rubbed away to a dull pewter. "Probably got it from a cereal box," Bryce scoffed. He stepped closer, crowding Gordon, invading his space. "Guys like you are a dime a dozen. You wear a piece of surplus junk and expect us to thank you for your service." Gordon slowly screwed the cap back onto his thermos. He placed it carefully beside him on the bench. He didn't look at them, but his voice, though quiet, cut through their laughter. "You should move along, boys." The simple command, delivered without heat, only enraged Bryce. Who was this old man to tell them what to do? Them, the future leaders of the world's greatest fighting force. "Or what, Grandpa?" Bryce spat. "You gonna bore us to death with a story about how tough things were in your day?" He reached out and shoved Gordon's shoulder. It wasn't a hard shove, but it was disrespectful. It crossed a line. Gordon didn't stumble. He seemed to absorb the force of it, his wiry frame as unyielding as an old oak root. He rose slowly to his feet. He was shorter than Bryce and 100 pounds lighter, yet for the first time the other cadets felt a flicker of uncertainty. There was something in the old man's posture, a coiled stillness that was more intimidating than any shout. "I will not tell you again," Gordon said, his voice still low, still calm. That was when Bryce's arrogance boiled over into something uglier. His face flushed with rage. To be challenged, however quietly, by this nobody, this relic in front of his peers, was an insult he could not bear. "You won't tell me again?" Bryce's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You are in no position to tell me anything." He unholstered the blue and orange training pistol from his hip, a standard issue item for their field exercises. The other cadets took a nervous step back. This was no longer just hazing an old man. "Bryce, maybe we should just go," Peterson said, his voice a nervous whisper. "Shut up, Peterson." Bryce snapped, his eyes locked on Gordon. This old fossil needs to learn a lesson about respecting his betters. He took a step forward and pressed the muzzle of the training pistol to Gordon's head. And that's when the world in the park seemed to slow down. A woman walking her dog froze, her hand flying to her mouth. A man reading a newspaper lowered it, his eyes wide, but no one moved, no one intervened. They were just bystanders to a drama they didn't understand. Bryce leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "Now, you are going to apologize to me for your disrespect. You are going to stand at attention and refer to me as sir. Understand?" Gordon's expression didn't change, but inside his mind, the present dissolved, replaced by a searing flash of the past. The cold plastic of the training pistol against his temple felt alien. The real thing, an M1911, was heavy, solid, a comforting weight in a young man's hand. The crisp autumn air of the park was replaced by the thick, humid stench of a jungle halfway around the world, a smell of mud, and rot, and blood. The arrogant face of the cadet morphed into the terrified eyes of an enemy soldier, a boy no older than Bryce, his hands raised in surrender across a muddy, blood-soaked trench. Gordon wasn't there in that memory as a victim. He was there as the storm. He was there as the one who held the line. The focus of the memory sharpened, coalescing on a single object, a hand, that of his captain, pressing a small tarnished eagle, globe, and anchor pin into his palm. The pin was still warm from the captain's pocket. It felt impossibly heavy. "They'll give you the official one later, Gunny," the captain's voice rasped, thick with exhaustion and grief. "But this one was my father's. He wore it on Iwo Jima. You honor him by wearing it now." The memory was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only an echo of profound sorrow and unshakable duty. He was back on the park bench, the training pistol still at his head, the boy still talking. "Look at it," Bryce sneered, flicking the old pin with his free hand. "Probably doesn't even know what it means." Across the street, Frank Jensen, a retired Army colonel in a faded polo shirt, had been on his way to buy a morning paper. He'd seen the cadets swaggering toward the old man and had thought nothing of it. Boys will be boys, full of piss and vinegar. He'd seen 1,000 like them, but when the pistol came out, his blood ran cold. He wasn't close enough to hear what they were saying, but he could see the rigid arrogance of the lead cadet, and he could see the old man. Frank's breath hitched. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of men in Baghdad, in the mountains of Afghanistan, and in the mirror after his own third tour. It was the unnerving calm of a man who had walked through hell and found it wanting. It was the look of a man who had made his peace with violence long ago and who was now, with great reluctance, reopening the door to it. And Frank knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that if someone didn't intervene in the next 30 seconds, those 4 cadets were going to learn a lesson that would break them for life. The old man wasn't in danger. They were. Frank's hand, shaking with a mixture of rage and adrenaline, fumbled for his phone. He didn't dial 911. The local police wouldn't understand the nuance of this. They'd see a training pistol and a confused old man. They'd get it wrong. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb jabbing at the screen. He knew exactly who to call. The phone rang twice before it was answered with a curt, "McRaven." "Marcus, it's Frank Jensen," Frank said, his voice clipped and urgent. He kept his eyes locked on the scene across the street. "I'm in the town square. You have 4 of your cadets assaulting an elderly man. One of them is holding a weapon to his head." There was a pause on the other end, then the general's voice, hard as flint. "Are you certain they're mine?" "I'm looking at their shoulder patches right now, Marcus. They're yours," Frank said. "And you need to get down here, not your MPs, you." The old man, he's not scared. He's about to solve this problem himself if you don't hurry, and I don't think you want to see how he solves it. "Describe the man, Frank," McRaven commanded. "Elderly, maybe late 80s, wiry, faded red windbreaker, and he has a pin on his lapel, an old eagle, globe and anchor." The silence on the other end of the line was suddenly profound. Frank could almost hear the gears turning in the general's head. "Frank," McRaven's voice was different now, tight with something that sounded like dread. "Describe the pin." "Exactly. It's old," Frank said, squinting. "Tarnished, worn almost smooth. Looks like it's been through a war or two." A sharp intake of breath. Then, "Stay there, Frank. Don't let him leave. I'm on my way." The line went dead. Frank Jensen lowered the phone, a knot of anticipation tightening in his stomach. He had a feeling this was about to become a very interesting Tuesday morning. Inside the stately oak-paneled office of the Commandant of Westmarch, General Marcus McRaven stood ramrod straight, the phone still pressed to his ear long after the line had gone dead. He placed it back in its cradle with a deliberate, controlled motion that betrayed the storm raging within him. Tarnished, worn smooth, an old Marine. His mind raced, connecting dots that had been scattered for decades. "Captain," he barked at the aide standing by the door. "Sir, get me the Level 9 clearance archives. I want the file for Operation Nightfall, not the declassified summary, the original, sealed records from SINPAC. Now." The captain's eyes widened. "Sir, that file is under triple seal. It requires presidential." "Did I stutter, Captain?" McRaven's voice was a low growl that tolerated no argument. The aide paled, nodded, and practically ran from the room. McRaven turned to his secure terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He entered a string of alphanumeric codes that granted him access to the military's deepest, darkest digital vaults. He typed in a set of keywords, Nightfall. Ghost Platoon. Sole Survivor. A single file appeared on the screen, its contents 90% redacted. But at the top there was a grainy black and white photograph taken over 50 years ago. It showed a young Marine sergeant, his face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, his eyes burning with an intensity that defied the monochrome image. Below the photo was a name, Whitaker, Gordon, and below that a designation that had become the stuff of legend in the shadowed corners of military history, call sign Ghost. McRaven felt a cold dread wash over him. It couldn't be. Not him. Not here. He grabbed his desk phone, the one with the direct lines to his senior staff. Colonel Davies, Major Thorne, assemble the entire command staff on the front steps. Class A uniforms. 5 minutes ago, he commanded. Scramble the command vehicles. Code 1 escort to the town square. Move. He slammed the phone down and strode towards the door, grabbing his formal peaked cap. The institution he commanded, the very bedrock of honor and discipline, had just committed an act of sacrilege, and he was going to have to be the one to atone for it. Back in the park, Bryce was drunk on his own power. Gordon's continued silence was a defiance he could not tolerate. It was like shouting at a mountain. The lack of response was more infuriating than any argument. "What's the matter, old man? Lost your nerve?" Bryce sneered, pushing the pistol a little harder. The other cadets shifted nervously. The joke, if it had ever been one, was long dead. This was something else now, something ugly and out of control. "I am a future officer of the United States Armed Forces," Bryce declared, puffing out his chest. "I represent the authority of this nation. You are an insignificant old man who is obstructing me. I could have you arrested. I could have you sent for a mental evaluation. You need to learn your place." It was the final, unforgivable overreach. He had completely inverted the roles of hero and villain, of strength and weakness. He saw the uniform on his own body but was blind to the decades of honor embodied in the quiet man standing before him. Gordon just watched him, his faded blue eyes holding a universe of experience that Bryce couldn't begin to comprehend. Then came the sound. It started as a distant wail, growing rapidly closer. Not the familiar yelp of a police car or the bellow of a fire truck. This was a piercing, multi-tone siren, the kind used for high-level military and government escorts. The crowd in the park murmured, turning their heads towards the sound. 3 gleaming black SUVs, flanked by 2 military police cruisers with lights flashing, screamed down the main street and screeched to a halt at the edge of the square. They didn't park neatly. They stopped at aggressive angles, blocking the road, their doors flying open before they had even stopped rocking. Out of the lead vehicle stepped General Marcus McRaven. He was a picture of command authority, his Class A uniform perfectly pressed, his chest a solid block of colorful ribbons, his face a mask of cold fury. He was followed by his entire senior command staff, a dozen colonels and majors, men used to giving orders, not taking them, all moving with a synchronized, terrifying purpose. The 4 cadets froze, their blood turned to ice water in their veins. They recognized the commandant instantly. Bryce's jaw went slack, and the training pistol in his hand suddenly felt like it was made of lead. His face, moments ago flushed with arrogant power, was now the color of ash. General McRaven's boots crunched on the grass as he strode forward. He did not look at the cadets. He did not acknowledge the crowd. His eyes, burning with a cold, intense fire, were locked on one man and one man only, Gordon Whitaker. His staff fanned out behind him, forming a silent, intimidating semicircle that separated the confrontation from the rest of the world. McRaven stopped precisely 3 feet in front of Gordon. He didn't glance at Bryce, or the pistol still pointed, trembling at Gordon's head. He simply stood there for a second, his presence sucking all the air out of the park. Then, with a crack of his heels on the dry grass that sounded like a rifle shot, he snapped to the most rigid, formal salute of his long and decorated career. "Sergeant Major Whitaker," McRaven's voice boomed, clear and powerful, echoing across the silent square. "General McRaven, Commandant of Westmarch. It is an honor, sir." The words hit the air with the force of a physical blow. "Sir." The commandant had called the old man sir. Bryce looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The title itself was a shock. Sergeant Major, the highest and most respected enlisted rank, a legend in its own right. But McRaven wasn't finished. He stood there, his hand held in that perfect salute, and began to speak again, his voice reciting a litany of valor as if from a sacred text he had long ago committed to memory. "Gordon Ghost Whitaker, United States Marine Corps, retired," he began, his voice ringing with a reverence that stunned the onlookers. "Recipient of the Navy Cross." He paused. Twice. The Silver Star. Another pause. 3 times. 16 Purple Hearts. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Frank Jensen, Across the street lowered his phone and allowed a slow, grim smile to spread across his face. He was the sole survivor of the siege of Anlock's ghost platoon. After holding the northern perimeter against 3 waves of enemy assault, McRaven continued, his eyes still fixed on Gordon. He is the man who single-handedly defended Hill 742 for 3 days and 3 nights with a captured machine gun and 7 rounds in his sidearm until reinforcements could arrive. McRaven finally lowered his salute, but his posture remained one of deep, abiding respect. Sergeant Major, your after-action reports are required reading for every officer candidate who walks through the gates of my academy. You are not a relic. You are the standard. The public vindication was absolute. The legend had been laid bare for all to see. The quiet old man in the worn jacket was revealed to be a giant, a pillar of the very institution that these boys had claimed to represent. Bryce finally clumsily lowered the training pistol. It slipped from his nerveless fingers and clattered onto the pavement. Only then did General McRaven turn his gaze upon the 4 cadets. The warmth and reverence in his expression vanished, replaced by an Arctic cold that was more terrifying than any shout. His voice dropped to a low, lethal whisper that was somehow more menacing than his earlier boom. "You," he said, pinning Bryce with a look of pure contempt. "Cadet, what is your name?" "Bryce Thompson, sir," he stammered, his body shaking. "Cadet Thompson," McRaven said, the words dripping with ice. "You put a weapon to the head of a living legend. You stood on the shoulders of giants like him to get a better look at your own reflection. You have disgraced that uniform. You have disgraced this academy. And you have disgraced the United States Marine Corps, whose honor this man defended with his own blood." He turned to his aide. "Captain, take them. They are expelled from Westmarch Academy, effective immediately. They will be processed out and escorted from this base within the hour. Their military careers are over before they began. See to it that their records reflect conduct unbecoming in the starkest possible terms." The cadets, white-faced and trembling, looked as though their worlds had just ended. They offered no protest as 2 stern-faced majors stepped forward to escort them away. McRaven turned back to Gordon, his expression softening once more into one of profound apology. "Sergeant Major Whitaker, on behalf of Westmarch and the entire armed forces, I am deeply and profoundly sorry for the dishonor you were shown today." Gordon Whitaker finally looked away from the horizon and met the general's eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He then looked at the retreating forms of the 4 disgraced cadets. "They're just boys, General," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a lifetime of authority, full of pride with no war to put it in. "They need to learn that the uniform doesn't make the man. The man has to be worthy of the uniform." It wasn't an excuse for their behavior, but a diagnosis, a piece of wisdom offered with grace instead of anger. Gordon's hand went to his lapel, his thumb gently rubbing the worn surface of the eagle globe and anchor. For a brief second, the park, the general and the crowd all faded away. He was 20 years old again, lying on a stretcher, the world a blur of pain and muddy green. A face leaned over him, his captain, a man he revered, his own face a mask of grief for the men they had lost. The captain pressed the small pin into Gordon's palm, closing his bloody fingers around it. "The official one will come later, Gunny," the captain had rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "But this one was my father's. He wore it on Iwo Jima. You honor him by wearing it now." The pin wasn't just metal, it was a link in a chain of honor, a legacy of sacrifice passed from one generation to the next, a legacy these boys had almost trampled under their feet. The fallout at Westmarch Academy was swift and decisive. General McRaven was true to his word. Within a week, a new mandatory course was added to the curriculum for all first-year cadets. It was called The Legacy of the Enlisted Foundations of Honor, and the first lesson plan was a detailed 3-hour case study on the service record of Sergeant Major Gordon "Ghost" Whitaker. The academy also issued a formal, public apology in the town's local newspaper, acknowledging the profound failure in leadership and character demonstrated by the former cadets and reaffirming its commitment to the values Sergeant Major Whitaker embodied. But the story's true epilogue took place a month later, not in a classroom or a parade ground, but in the sterile, fluorescent-lit aisle of a local grocery store. Bryce Thompson, stripped of his uniform and his future, was now stocking shelves, his movements mechanical, his eyes downcast. He wore a stained red apron and a name tag. He was restocking canned soup when he heard a quiet voice beside him. "The chicken noodle is better than the tomato." Bryce froze. He looked up slowly and saw Gordon Whitaker standing there, holding a shopping basket. The old man wasn't smiling, but his eyes held no malice. There was no "I told you so," no lingering anger. There was only a quiet, unnerving sense of peace. Bryce's first instinct was to flee, to disappear between the shelves of pasta and pickles. He felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck, so intense it was almost dizzying. He couldn't speak. He just stared, waiting for the condemnation he knew he deserved. Gordon picked up a can of chicken noodle soup and placed it in his basket. He looked directly at Bryce, not as a hero to a disgrace, but simply as one man to another. "It's a heavy burden, son," Gordon said, his voice soft. "That pride of yours, it can be a powerful tool, or it can be a poison. The hardest lesson we ever learn is the difference." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet aisle. "Don't let this be the end of your story. Let it be the beginning of a better one." He gave a single brief nod, then turned and continued his shopping, his footsteps making a soft shuffling sound on the linoleum floor. Bryce was left standing alone in the aisle, surrounded by cans of soup. For the first time since he was a small child, he felt tears welling in his eyes. It was in that moment of quiet, unexpected grace that his true education finally began. The story of Gordon Whitaker reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the quietest of forms. If you were inspired by this story of valor and vindication, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories, and share it with someone who needs to hear it.